I was holding my grandson's drawing when my daughter-in-law destroyed my world with 7 words. The crayon sketch trembled in my weathered hands. A stick-figure family with Grandpa Harold, written in crooked letters beneath the tallest figure. 8-year-old Emma had pressed it into my palm just minutes earlier, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the crowded living room where our Christmas dinner was winding down. The house buzzed with conversation and laughter, the kind of warm chaos that Margaret and I had dreamed of when we first bought our little home 43 years ago. David was clearing plates with the methodical precision he'd inherited from his mother, while 10-year-old Jake showed off his new video game to anyone who'd listen. The smell of Rebecca's honey ham still lingered in the air, mixing with the pine scent from the tree we'd all decorated together just 3 days before. I should have known something was wrong when Rebecca approached me with that particular smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She'd worn it at Margaret's funeral, at my retirement dinner, at every family gathering for the past 3 years. I'd learned to recognize it as the expression she reserved for duties she found distasteful. "Harold," she said, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that made my stomach clench. "I need to talk to you." "A deal?" The room seemed to grow quieter, though conversations continued around us. David's movement slowed as he pretended not to listen. Jake's excited chatter about his game faded to background noise. Even Emma, coloring at the coffee table, looked up with those wide, intuitive eyes that children have, the ones that sense when something important is happening. "Of course, Rebecca," I managed, still clutching Emma's drawing like it could somehow protect me from whatever was coming. She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive that Margaret would have called trying too hard. Her green eyes, which David had once described as captivating, now held the cold efficiency of someone about to deliver bad news to a stranger. "You need to understand something," she began, each word carefully measured, deliberately cruel. "You're not really family anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, my breathing become shallow. The drawing crumpled slightly in my grip as my hands began to shake. "Margaret was the connection," she continued, her voice never wavering, never softening. "And she's gone. We tolerate you out of politeness, nothing more." Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Even Jake's video game seemed to go quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, David's guilty avoidance of my gaze, the children's confused looks, the other relatives pretending to be absorbed in their conversations while hanging on every word. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind her of the countless nights I'd spent in this very house when David was sick as a child, of the college tuition I'd helped pay, of the down payment I'd contributed when they bought their first home. I wanted to tell her about the grandfather clock I'd built with my own hands that stood in their hallway, about the swing set in the backyard that bore the wear marks of my grandson's small hands, about the photo albums filled with memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings where I'd been present for every single one. Instead, I folded Emma's drawing carefully, my fingers moving with the deliberate slowness of a man trying not to fall apart in front of his grandchildren. The paper felt impossibly fragile, like everything else in my life had suddenly become. "I see," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. That night, I left my son's house for what I believed would be the last time, carrying nothing but my coat and the devastating weight of Rebecca's words. As I drove through the quiet streets lined with Christmas lights, I had no idea that 8 months later, those same grandchildren would change everything, and that my response would shock even myself. The silence in my house became a living thing that winter. For 3 weeks after that Christmas dinner, I didn't leave, except for groceries and doctor appointments. My phone sat on the kitchen counter like an accusation, its screen dark and unforgiving. No calls from David, No messages asking how I was doing. The silence confirmed what Rebecca had declared. I truly wasn't family anymore. Emma's drawing still hung on my refrigerator, held in place by the same magnetic clip that had once secured Margaret's shopping lists. Every morning I'd pour my coffee and stare at those crooked stick figures, feeling something crack a little deeper inside my chest. The little girl had written, "I love you, Grandpa," at the bottom in purple crayon. She'd been 7 when she made it, not understanding that love could be revoked by proxy. January melted into February with the slow, grinding persistence of old grief. I found myself talking to Margaret's photograph on the mantel, telling her about the cold that seemed to seep into my bones, no matter how high I turned the thermostat. "They think you were just a bridge between us," I whispered to her smile one particularly dark evening. "Like you weren't real, like what we built together was just temporary." The worst part wasn't the loneliness. I'd grown accustomed to that after Margaret passed. The worst part was how right Rebecca seemed to be. Without my wife's gentle insistence on family dinners and holiday gatherings, what exactly was my role? I was just an old man with arthritic hands and too many memories of birthday parties where I'd been needed. But something else was growing in that silence, something I didn't recognize at first. It started as a low hum of resentment during my sleepless nights, replaying Rebecca's words until they lost all power to hurt. Then it evolved into something sharper, more focused. I began to see the pattern, how she'd always positioned herself between David and me, how family discussions somehow never included my input, how my contributions had been acknowledged with polite smiles and quickly forgotten. By March, I'd stopped checking my phone entirely. When Mrs. Chen from next door asked why I looked so thin, I just shrugged and said I was fine. When my old construction buddy Frank invited me to poker night, I declined with the excuse about being tired. I was becoming exactly what Rebecca had accused me of being, a ghost haunting the edges of a family that had moved on without me. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of revelation, no lightning strike of clarity. Instead, it was like watching ice form on a pond, gradual, inevitable, and stronger than it appeared. Each day of silence added another layer to something that was hardening inside me. Not bitterness exactly, but a kind of crystalline resolve. I started taking longer walks around the neighborhood, observing families through lit windows, watching fathers push children on swings, seeing grandfathers teaching young boys to throw baseballs. I wasn't envious anymore. I was studying them, trying to understand what real family bonds looked like versus the brittle politeness I'd been settling for. One evening in late March, I found myself standing in David's old bedroom, which I'd left unchanged since he moved out 15 years ago. His high school trophies still lined the shelves, and the model airplane we'd built together hung from the ceiling, gathering dust, but still perfectly balanced. I'd spent countless hours in this room, helping with homework, talking through teenage heartbreaks, teaching him how to tie a Windsor knot for his first job interview. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper from the corner where she used to sit, reading bedtime stories. "They don't get to erase us, Harold. They don't get to decide our worth." That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully, because something inside me had finally crystallized into an unshakable truth. I knew exactly who I was, even if they'd forgotten. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous thing of all, a man who remembers his own value when everyone else has forgotten it. I had no idea that spring would bring a moment that would test everything I'd learned about myself in those long, silent months. I almost didn't see them. It was a Tuesday in late April, one of those deceptively warm spring days that tricks you into thinking winter is finally over. I'd driven downtown to pick up a prescription and grab lunch at the little diner where Margaret and I used to share cherry pie on our anniversary. The mundane routine of an old man trying to fill empty hours. I was walking back to my truck, keys already in my hand, when something in my peripheral vision made me stop dead in my tracks. Two small figures huddled against the brick wall of Murphy's grocery, holding cardboard signs that looked like they'd been torn from moving boxes. My heart recognized them before my mind could process what I was seeing. Emma and Jake, my grandchildren, my blood, my legacy, the two people in this world who still called me Grandpa, were sitting on the cold concrete, begging strangers for food. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the truck's door handle so tightly I could feel the metal digging into my palm. Emma's hair hung in greasy strands around her face, and her jacket, one I'd bought her last Christmas, was stained and too thin for the weather. Jake's sign, written in his careful 10-year-old handwriting, simply said, "Please help. We're hungry." A woman walked past them without slowing down, her heels clicking against the sidewalk like a countdown. A businessman in a hurry stepped around them as if they were street furniture. But I saw the way Emma's shoulders shook, how Jake's eyes darted nervously at every approaching stranger, the hollow look that hunger leaves on young faces. Everything Rebecca had said that Christmas night evaporated into meaningless noise. These children, scared, cold, desperate, were being ignored by the same world that would judge me for caring about them. I stayed hidden behind my truck for nearly 20 minutes, watching, my mind racing through possibilities and explanations. Where was David? Where was Rebecca? How had it come to this? The questions hammered against my skull like angry fists, but no answers came, only the devastating image of my granddaughter wiping her nose on her sleeve and my grandson's stomach rumbling loud enough for me to hear from 30 feet away. Finally, I forced my legs to move. I approached them slowly, the way you might approach wounded animals, my heart breaking with each step. When Emma looked up and saw me, her eyes went wide with recognition and something that looked like shame. "Grandpa Harold?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the street noise. Jake scrambled to hide his sign behind his back, as if that could somehow undo what I'd already seen. Mom said we're not supposed to—" "Hey there, sweetheart," I managed, kneeling down to their level despite the protest from my arthritic knees. Up close, I could see the dark circles under Emma's eyes, the way Jake's clothes hung loose on his frame. "What are you two doing here?" The story came out in fragments, whispered confessions between nervous glances. Dad had lost his job 3 months ago. Mom was too proud to ask for help. They'd been eating 1 meal a day, sometimes less. The electricity had been turned off last week. They were 3 days away from losing their apartment. "We didn't want to bother anybody," Jake said, his voice cracking with the effort of trying to sound grown up. "Mom said sometimes families have to figure things out on their own." The irony hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca, who had expelled me from their family with such cold efficiency, was now learning what it meant to have nowhere to turn. The woman who had declared me irrelevant was discovering that pride makes a bitter meal when your children are starving. But as I looked at Emma's tear-stained face and Jake's brave attempt to protect his mother's dignity, even while begging for food, I realized something profound was happening inside me. The anger I'd been nursing for months was transforming into something else entirely, a crystalline clarity about what really mattered. These children weren't Rebecca's weapons or David's responsibilities. They were my grandchildren, carrying my blood and Margaret's gentle spirit. They were innocent victims of adult failures and stubborn pride. And in that moment, sitting on cold concrete with 2 hungry children, I understood exactly what kind of man I wanted to be. Not the bitter old fool who'd been licking his wounds all winter. Not the ghost haunting the edges of a family that had forgotten him, but the grandfather I'd always been in my heart, the one who shows up when it matters, who chooses love over pride, who proves his worth through actions rather than words. "Listen to me," I said, pulling both children close enough to feel their small bodies trembling. "You're never going to have to do this again. Do you understand me? Never." What I did next would shock everyone, including myself. But sometimes the most powerful responses come from the quietest hearts, and I was about to remind them all exactly what kind of man they'd tried to throw away. I didn't just buy them lunch. That would have been charity, and charity wasn't what these children needed. They needed their grandfather back. Within the hour, I had Emma and Jake in my truck, their cardboard signs thrown away forever, heading to the McDonald's where they devoured Happy Meals like they hadn't seen food in days. While they ate, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my old foreman, Mike Santos, who now ran his own construction company. "Mike, it's Harold. I need a favor. And I need it today." By the time I hung up, David had a job interview scheduled for Thursday morning, full-time with benefits and a starting salary that would solve their immediate problems. The second call was to my bank. Margaret and I had lived modestly, saved carefully. The number in our account had grown substantial over the years, especially with my pension and her life insurance. "I need to make some transfers," I told Janet, our long-time teller. "Today." The third call was the hardest one. I dialed David's number, and when he answered with his defeated, exhausted voice, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Your children were begging for food outside Murphy's grocery today," I said quietly. "I'm bringing them home to you now, and we're going to fix this. All of it." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Finally, I heard something that sounded like a sob. "Dad, I'm so sorry. We didn't know what to do. Rebecca said we couldn't ask you for help after what happened." "Son," I said, watching Emma carefully color on a napkin while Jake organized his French fries by size. "Pride doesn't feed children. I'm about to show you what family really means." When we arrived at their apartment, the reality was worse than I'd imagined. The power was indeed off, candles providing the only light. Rebecca sat at their kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills. Her perfect composure finally cracked. When she saw me walk in with the children, her face went through a series of emotions: shock, shame, defiance, and finally, something that looked like relief. "Harold, she began, but I held up my hand. "We're not talking about Christmas night," I said calmly. "We're talking about right now. Your lights are getting turned back on this afternoon. Your rent is being paid through the end of the year. David has a job interview Thursday morning with Santos Construction. Mike's expecting him, and he pays fair wages." David stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. But I wasn't finished. "More importantly," I continued, settling into their living room chair like I belonged there, because I did, "we're going to establish some new family rules. First, when someone in this family is struggling, we ask for help. Pride doesn't protect children from hunger. Second, family means showing up for each other, especially when it's difficult. Third, respect flows both ways, always." I pulled out the envelope I'd prepared at the bank and set it on their coffee table. "There's enough in there to cover groceries for 3 months and to get you stabilized while David starts his new job. It's not a loan, it's not charity, and you don't need to pay it back. It's what grandfathers do for their families." Rebecca's carefully constructed walls finally crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she looked from the envelope to her children, who were curled up on either side of me on the couch. "I don't understand," she whispered. "After what I said to you, after how we treated you." I looked at her directly, my voice steady and calm. "Rebecca, I've spent 4 months learning something important. You can't diminish a man's worth by refusing to see it. You can only diminish your own ability to recognize value when it's standing right in front of you." The moment hung in the air, like something sacred. Emma climbed into my lap and pressed her face against my chest, and Jake took my hand in his small one. David sat heavily in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "I made a mistake, Dad," he said quietly. "I should have stood up for you. I should have protected what you and Mom built. I was a coward. You were caught between two people you love, I replied. That's not cowardice, son. That's impossible positioning. But now we're going to do better, all of us. What happened next surprised even me. Rebecca stood up, walked over to where I sat with the children and knelt down beside my chair. When she spoke, her voice was thick with tears and genuine remorse. Harold, I was wrong. Not just about the family thing, but about everything. I was so focused on creating my own version of family that I tried to erase the foundation you and Margaret built. I was jealous of something beautiful because I didn't understand it. I'm sorry. For the first time in months, I felt something in my chest loosen, a knot of pain I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. We all make mistakes, Rebecca. The question is, what we do next. That evening, we shared dinner together by candlelight while waiting for the power company to restore their electricity. Emma showed me her latest drawings, Jake taught me about his video game, and for the first time since Margaret's death, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. As I prepared to leave that night, Emma hugged my legs tightly. "Grandpa Harold, are you really our family again?" I knelt down and looked into her earnest little face. "Sweetheart, I never stopped being your family. Sometimes it just takes people a while to remember what that means." What I had discovered in those months of silence was finally clear. True strength isn't about demanding respect. It's about being so secure in your own worth that you can offer grace even to those who've wounded you. But the most important lesson was yet to come. 3 months later, I was teaching Jake how to build a birdhouse when David found me in my garage workshop. The transformation in my son was remarkable. The Santos construction job had given him more than financial stability. It had restored his confidence. His shoulders no longer carried the defeated slouch of a man who'd failed his family. His eyes held the clarity of someone who'd remembered his own worth. "Dad," he said, settling onto the old wooden stool where he used to sit as a boy, watching me work on weekend projects. "I need to tell you something." I continued guiding Jake's small hands as he struggled with the sandpaper, but I was listening. Outside, I could hear Emma's laughter as Rebecca pushed her on the swing I'd hung from my oak tree the week before, the same tree where David had once built a treehouse with his mother's patient encouragement. That night last Christmas, when Rebecca said those things, David's voice caught slightly. I died, a little inside. Not because I agreed with her, but because I was too weak to defend you. I watched the man who taught me everything about integrity and strength get torn down, and I said nothing. Jake looked up at me with his grandfather's eyes, Margaret's eyes, waiting to see how I'd respond to his father's pain. In that moment, I realized the most important lesson hadn't been about proving my worth to them. It had been about teaching them that love doesn't keep score, that family means showing up even when it hurts, that grace is stronger than grudges. "Son," I said quietly, still focused on the birdhouse, "the strongest men I've ever known weren't the ones who never fell down. They were the ones who got back up and learned to build something better." David's eyes filled with tears. "You saved us, Dad. Not just financially, but you saved who we are as a family. Rebecca sees it now. The kids see it. And I finally see what Mom saw in you all those years." That evening, as we gathered around my dinner table, a tradition that had naturally resumed without discussion, Rebecca stood up before dessert. She held a small, wrapped box in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "Harold," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "I spent 2 years trying to create my own version of family by erasing yours. I thought strength meant independence, that love meant keeping score. I was wrong about everything." She handed me the box, and when I opened it, my breath caught. Inside was Margaret's wedding ring, the one I'd given Rebecca when Margaret passed, thinking she might want to pass it down to Emma someday. "This belongs with you," she said softly. "You're the keeper of this family's heart, and you always have been. I want my children to learn about love from watching you, not from listening to my misguided attempts to redefine what we already had. I slipped Margaret's ring onto my pinky finger where it fit perfectly. For the first time in almost a year, I felt her presence clearly, not as a ghost haunting my loneliness, but as the foundation of everything good we'd built together. Family isn't about perfection, I said, looking around the table at these people who'd hurt me, rejected me, and then welcomed me back. It's about forgiveness, persistence, and showing up when it matters most. Your mother understood that, and now you do too. Emma climbed into my lap as I spoke, her small hands tracing the ring on my finger. "Grandpa Harold," she whispered, "will you always be our family now?" I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Always, sweetheart. Even when I'm not here anymore, I'll still be your family." That's what love does. It makes itself permanent. 6 months ago, I was a man whose worth had been questioned, whose place had been erased, whose love had been deemed insufficient. Today, I am exactly who I've always been. A grandfather who understands that true strength lies not in demanding recognition, but in consistently showing up with open hands and an open heart. Margaret's voice seems to whisper from the kitchen where she once made Sunday dinners. "Well done, my love. Well done." Mundrul, the most powerful truth I've learned is this: you cannot lose your place in someone's heart by being too generous with yours. Love multiplies when you give it away, and family is built by those brave enough to keep choosing each other, especially when it's difficult. If this story has touched your heart the way these moments have touched mine, I'd be honored if you'd like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to remember that families are built by love, not by rules.